an invasion would be extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. Seaborne invasion of a small island, quite a mountainous island where the opposition can go and hide in the mountains for, who knows, decades. So that would be a very high-risk operation. Plus, China is crucially dependent on its economic trade with the West. The Chinese deal with the people is, we will make you richer each year, even if you don't have the kind of range of democratic and civil rights that they have in the West. And if there were heavy sanctions against China over its actions against Taiwan, that would put that at risk. So I think he'll move cautiously.
I mean, should we be prepared for war on multiple fronts? And I suppose crucially, are we remotely prepared for that?
I think we're being challenged on multiple fronts, John. I wouldn't overstate the amount of coordination and cooperation that's going on. Yes, the Russians are buying drones from Iran and missiles from North Korea, but I'm not sure it's yet. It's not a kind of malign, evil equivalent to NATO out there yet. But there is a sort of alliance building between Russia and China, and I think George Grills was absolutely right to say that the Chinese will be watching what happens both in Ukraine and in Gaza and in the Red Sea very closely, because they are unhappy about who has won the Taiwanese election. They are building up their own forces. They're finding various ways of intimidating Taiwan. And there are those military analysts. I'm not a military analyst. I don't agree. I'm not quite as pessimistic. There are those who think that the Chinese are preparing for some sort of military action against Taiwan towards the end of this decade. So we certainly live in very dangerous times.
Why do you say you're not especially a pessimist on that? Why are you more of an optimist?
Look, I think China has, President Xi wants, as part of his kind of his life plan, his ambitions for his leadership, and he is the most dominant leader in China since Deng Xiaoping or Mao Zedong further back. He has unification as one of his main objectives, and he has never ruled out, he's refused ever to rule out military action. But I think it's more likely that he will go down a route of potentially of trying to blockade Taiwan, trying to disrupt Taiwanese trade, intimidate them, pressure them, keep sending aircraft and ships through Taiwanese airspace and territorial waters, and this kind of thing, rather than an invasion would be extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. Seaborne invasion of a small island, quite a mountainous island where the opposition can go and hide in the mountains for, who knows, decades. So that would be a very high-risk operation. Plus, China is crucially dependent on its economic trade with the West. The Chinese deal with the people is, we will make you richer each year, even if you don't have the kind of range of democratic and civil rights that they have in the West. And if there were heavy sanctions against China over its actions against Taiwan, that would put that at risk. So I think he'll move cautiously.
Okay, so do not be too alarmed too quickly about Taiwan. That's your message there. Now, what about Europe? Because, look, Vladimir Putin's ambitions are very well known, and so are Donald Trump's thoughts on NATO and on Ukraine. And in both cases, Donald Trump is far from being wedded to the idea of giving Ukraine the backing that it's had, or of continuing the American relationship with NATO, which is a huge challenge for the Western alliance and for European powers.
That's absolutely right. And if I were Vladimir Putin, the first objective for 2024 would be to keep the war going in Ukraine until you get past the American elections. Because why wouldn't you wait to see if Donald Trump wins and if American policy then changes? Because let's be no doubt, John, without American arms supplies to Ukraine, they will lose the war. They're not going to get enough from Europe. We don't have the capacity in Europe to give them enough to enable them to win. So this is a critical point. It's already dangerous because the Republicans in Congress have so far blocked the next tranche of American military aid because they want to add some legislation to that about strengthening the southern border defenses. But anyway, Trump has said that he would stop military aid to Ukraine. And if you're Vladimir Putin, you're thinking, well, I'd like to see what happens if that were to happen, and
right.
How will we then do in Ukraine? So that is very, very dangerous. Longer term, Trump was always clear in his first term. In fact, he virtually said it publicly that he was no fan of NATO, that he thought America took far too great a burden, as it does actually, And he even hinted to some visitors that he would quite like to take America out of NATO. At the very least, and I think he said this publicly in his campaigning, he would want a fundamental reassessment of US policy on NATO and US positioning in NATO. But it could go a lot further.
Well, I mean, indeed, I just wonder, and briefly, because I want to get your thoughts on the Middle East finally, but how does Europe, how does NATO, and UK included, how do they prepare for the possibility of a drastic change of policy on the part of Washington towards Europe and NATO?
The most convincing thing that Europe could do, John, is actually quite a simple thing, but very difficult in current economic circumstances, which is everyone who has promised to spend 2% of GDP on defence, and that is every member of NATO, that's a NATO-wide commitment, actually does it. At the moment, I think there are 6 countries that do it. We're one of them, of course. And I think that is Trump's main criticism. He once said of NATO that it's a scam under which the Europeans get America to pay for their defence. And if we all hit the 2% mark, then that would make a difference. And by the way, it's some of the richer countries in NATO that aren't there yet, like Germany and Italy. So that's an obvious thing. Apart from that, I'm sure there is lots of conversation going on between chancelleries around Europe about how to manage and cope with a Trump presidency. We've been through it once before, 2016 to 2020, but it'll be tougher this time because he knows how to run a government.
All right, let me just ask you finally, go back to where we started, which is the Middle East. Now, as we watch that story develop hour by hour, day by day, how do you believe that Israel's friends, including Britain, including, of course, the United States, should use that influence and say pressure is needed, while at the same time supporting Israel in the conflict?
I think every day that the Israeli ground offensive in Gaza goes on, and look, they have a complete right to self-defense and they have the right to go into Gaza and do what they're doing, but it needed to be a quick operation. Every day that it now carries on, they lose international support, international criticism of Gaza, of the Israeli government increases, and also Western governments which are supporting them are struggling and losing support because of it, particularly, by the way, Joe Biden's Democrat administration in America. So the pressure, I think, has got to be on Israel. They're never going to win a complete victory there. You can't completely eliminate Hamas. They need to find a point soon where they declare victory and they start thinking about the aftermath. Who runs Gaza afterwards? And most particularly, how do they then negotiate some sort of long-term solution with the Palestinians? I know Netanyahu and others are ruling out a 2-state solution. I don't see what the alternative is to it.